Hey folks, welcome back. I'm your host, R.R. Slugger, and if you're a fan of LEGO Space from the 90s, like I am, then you've probably heard a line similar to this before. LEGO Unitron was released from 1994 to 1995 and served as a replacement to the Space Police, featuring a stronger military focus. I've read some variation of that same sentiment dozens of times, most recently within a fairly fallacious article from Blocks magazine. The idea that Unitron is some sort of military, or that they serve as some sort of heavily armed reinforcement to the Space Police has just always sat wrong with me. What is the reason for this interpretation? What sources support or refute this theory? If you're interested in learning more, stick with me as we dive into the lore surrounding Unitron. Well, perhaps not dive. As you'll come to see, the pool is a little too shallow for safe diving. Ultimately, I'm hoping to change some minds here today, because I think there's a false narrative that's been beaten into us LEGO Space fans through blind repetition. Someone somewhere decided that Unitron was a military, and that interpretation was taken as gospel and repeated over and over across the internet. I want to dispel that myth today. Someone has to. Unitron is a tiny LEGO Space sub-theme containing somewhere between 3 to 5 sets. Though the opinion of online databases has largely calcified on that number being 4, I think there's actually a unique amount of debate to be had here. Let's start with the 3 that are pretty much indisputable. 1787 Crater Cruiser, 1789 Starhawk 2, and 1793 Space Station Xenon. All 3 of these sets featured the Unitron logo on their boxes, the same color palette across the board, and share identical region exclusivity of release, largely only being available in the North American market. The 4th set that is often grouped in with the other 3 is set 6991 Monorail Transport Base. This set features the Unitron minifigures and color scheme. However, it notably does not say Unitron anywhere on the box. Even the inside flap makes no mention of the series, spending more time talking about other space themes instead. This is likely due to the Monorail Transport Base being released first, the sole potential Unitron entry from 1994. It's entirely possible that the Unitron series wasn't yet settled on, and the Monorail Transport Base was retroactively grandfathered in. Also of note is that the Monorail Transport Base was not region exclusive like the rest of Unitron, available worldwide through LEGO Shop at Home. Additionally, the set number follows the tradition of LEGO Space sets starting with either 6-8 or 6-9, whereas the rest of Unitron follows a 1-7 pattern. Curious indeed. The final set that may have a claim to stake in the Unitron name is 1785 Crater Critters. Like the Monorail Transport Base, this set doesn't mention Unitron anywhere on its box. In fact, the Crater Critters box is nearly an anomaly unto itself. It's really something to behold. On the surface, the Crater Critters might appear to have little to do with Unitron, but I would be remiss not to mention that the color scheme of the blue robot actually appears very similar to that of the other sets in the series. I've often heard the red robot described as having the Spyrius color scheme, but this is a bit more of a stretch to me. Spyrius just never featured light gray in this kind of quantity. My interpretation here is that the Crater Critters are not meant to be seen as minifigure scaled. They kind of exist in their own little world outside of Unitron or Spyrius. I think the Crater Critters have far more in common with a typical creator set than a typical space set. With that being said though, they do share Unitron set numbering conventions and region exclusivity, which is more than the Monorail Transport Base can claim. Makes you wonder. I'm not really sure what I'm trying to say with this section of the video, except that it's disputable as to which sets really belong to Unitron. As such, we're going to take them all into consideration when dissecting the origins of the military myth surrounding this theme. LEGO Media Magazine and other related media is going to be our primary source to draw from when it comes to piecing together the lore of Unitron. As mentioned earlier, there really isn't much here though, as the bulk of what constitutes this theme only released in the North American market and wasn't advertised elsewhere. So, to begin with, I'd like to start by showing all of the contemporary sources that support the idea that Unitron is a military. Wait, that's it? There's gotta be some more here somewhere. This is all I could find, so let's examine it in earnest. Space Station Xenon is the command center for all Unitron forces. You'll spend a lot of time training here for top secret interstellar missions against spurious spies. Z, as we call it, is like combining Earth's NASA, FBI, and CIA. That description would imply a militaristic focus for the theme, at least to the extent of counterintelligence. If it were the only source of lore we had to go off of, I could absolutely understand why folks would repeat the claim that Unitron is a military. The problem is that it's not the only source. In fact, this one product description stands as an incongruous abnormality when compared to the other sources we have. Over and over again, planet Unitron is described as being the crossroads of the universe, where aliens from across the galaxy congregate in a central hub for adventure. Product descriptions for other sets make no mention of Unitron's militaristic intentions. Rather, they imply the opposite, with a repeated focus on exploration and discovery. Space Station Xenon itself is even described this way in a different magazine. Listen to this. In the farthest reaches of outer space, 3 astronauts guard Space Station Xenon, command base for the Unitron team. While an all-terrain vehicle explores the alien landscape and a Unitron spacecraft sweeps across the sky, the station's giant antenna monitors the horizon for upcoming adventures. With the sole similarity seemingly being the reference to Space Station Xenon serving as a command base, we see an entirely different categorization for the Unitron minifigures here. Notice that they're not referred to as Unitron forces, but rather a team of astronauts. If this was the only product description out there for this set, I doubt anyone would make the leap to calling it a military base. The emphasis on outer space adventures is also echoed here, as this element is really what serves as the true through line to the series. Even within the same magazine that inexplicably describes Unitron resembling the CIA, we see counterexamples littering the page. This one product description has done a lot of long-term damage to the characterization of Unitron. To be fair though, maybe there's some supporting evidence within the sets themselves. Starting with 1785 Crater Critters, we see... Well, moving on, set 1787 Crater Cruiser features antennae that could be interpreted to be laser weapons. Additionally, with the pod removed, the rear section can be flipped forward to reveal what could be seen as a weapon system. However, viewing LEGO Space through this lens is a slippery slope to descend. Are the Explorians harboring gigantic space cannons under the guise of exploration? Is Ice Planet secretly a production site for the galaxy's greatest density of intercontinental ballistic missiles? As quack Sigmund Freud once put it, sometimes a space antenna is just a space antenna. We can't assume that everything that could be a weapon is a weapon. Or we can, but then we have to be consistent with that interpretation and apply it evenly to other space themes. If Unitron is a military, then so are the Explorians. And that's not how I've seen them described at all. You can absolutely play in that universe if you want to, but I don't think it's the interpretation that was intended. Still, I'm not trying to gatekeep and say that a war in the stars is the wrong way to look at LEGO Space. I'm just trying to set the record straight on Unitron specifically and how it's regarded in context. Starhawk 2, Space Station Xenon, and the monorail transport base all feature similar elements that could be interpreted one way or the other. You might see these deployable apparatuses on the Starhawk as laser weapons, but I think a much more interesting interpretation is that they're delicate pieces of scanning equipment stored away for protection when not in use. They even use transparent clear pips on the ends of them. These are lenses, and we see a similar one on the viewfinder of the Unitron astronaut's handheld scanning device. Or maybe it's a space gun. It doesn't change the fact that the viewfinder is using the same design language as the components of the Starhawk 2. I could keep going with all of the sets that call Unitron home, but I hope you can see my point here. If we want to interpret everything within Unitron as a weapon and use that as supporting evidence for a militaristic characterization, then we need to do so with all LEGO Space themes. Personally, I think the evidence overwhelmingly points to Unitron being a theme best described as a central hub for generic space adventure, not a military force meant to augment or supplant the space police, as it's so often described online these days. Still, in making this video, I wasn't able to shake the idea that there was another source for the term military being thrown around in discourse surrounding Unitron. Why military specifically? Remember, in the sole piece of supporting evidence for this myth, we see Unitron being compared to NASA, the FBI, and the CIA, all of which are civilian agencies under the direction of the United States government, and not a part of its military. Where had the term military come from in regards to its relationship with Unitron? Well, I think I found out. In 2007, a Brikipedia admin wrote the following. Taking over the good guy space agency from the Space Police 2 was the Unitron, a more military-themed group. This description has remained nearly unchanged on Brikipedia for almost 20 years. Never once has it been accurately sourced or fact-checked, but rather taken as gospel and parroted across the internet. All because one person felt that Unitron looked like a military to them. If there's a takeaway from this whole video, I hope it's twofold. Firstly, I mean what I say in the title. Unitron is not a military. The strongest available evidence does not support this conclusion, and its repetition over the years speaks to an unfortunate lack of inquiry on the part of the writers repeating the claim. Secondly, the age-old adage rings true. Don't believe everything you read on the internet. The consequences of repeating misinformation can be exponential as more and more works base their assumptions on the uncited claims of previous writers. Once you're primed to view something through a certain lens, you're much more likely to view it that way. However, you have to sometimes stop and ask why you're being primed to view it through that lens in the first place. I know that we're ultimately discussing the fictional lore about a plastic toy today, but I think the lessons learned here are more broadly applicable. Think critically, but also be willing to accept facts that disprove what you want to believe. I say this a lot in some of my conversations within the comment sections of these videos, but I'm always happy to be proven wrong, but I must be proven wrong. I extend the same invitation here. If you think you have contemporary sources that back up the Unitron is a military interpretation, send them my way. I wasn't able to find them, but I'm not arrogant enough to claim that because I didn't find them, they can't exist. If you find any use of the term military in conjunction with Unitron prior to 2007, I'd also like to know that as well. It's possible that Brikipedia admin was referencing something else when they originally wrote their page for the theme. Lastly, please don't bother the admin in question. They're just a person who was volunteering time to work on a website 20 years ago, and they've been uninvolved with it for at least the past 15 as far as I can tell. The greater onus is on those who copied this claim without confirmation all these years.
Who's the more foolish, the fool or the fool who follows him?
Thanks for watching, everyone. I've been your host, R.R. Slugger, and I'll see you next time for another video.